And speaking of things coming this fall, it feels like it's coming like a freight train. I don't know if you feel that, but fall is almost here, which means summer is kind of winding down, and we've been in this series called Streams in the Desert, and we're kind of winding down our series as well. And this morning, we are going to be talking about Sabbath. Now, our last few weeks, we've talked about living with limits in our bodies. We've talked about Psalm 1 and what the blessed life looks like. We've talked about learning how to talk to ourselves. Last week, Proverbs 3 was super helpful for us. But this morning, we're going to focus specifically on the practice of Sabbath. And at first thought, you might be thinking, gosh, that feels like mixed signals because we just have all this stuff and activity that's happening this fall. And there's this volunteer night and there's all of these volunteer needs. And aren't these two kind of contradicting messages where you're telling me to volunteer and jump in and do? And then this morning's message is the importance of rest. And I hope that as we spend this time together this morning that you see that these are two complementary things, that it's actually when we rest that we're formed into Christ's image. And when we rest, we can be informed of how we are to invest our lives and spend our lives here on earth. And so these things aren't in contradiction to themselves, but they're actually complementary. But I want to speak just real quickly about the topic of Sabbath and how we got here and talking about it together this morning. And for me personally, my wife and I are part of a life group. And a few months ago, when we were studying in the book of Hebrews, we came across a passage where Sabbath was brought up. And we as a group were really intrigued. We thought, gosh, this is something that we've talked about, something we've heard about, but we were really interested to learning a little bit more about Sabbath. And so we as a group decided, maybe it'd be good for us to take a break and really do a deep dive on Sabbath. And it was a really fruitful couple of weeks that we spent learning and studying and discussing and putting into practice. But I want to say there was something that was really surprising to us that we all discovered. And it was that most of our modern evangelical upbringing had somehow left out the discussion of Sabbath. Somehow it had left out this essential practice. And as I pondered this personally, it kind of caused me to wonder why. Several reasons came up in my mind. Maybe it was because some had just determined this was just an ancient practice that was way out there for back then. Or maybe it was a practice just for the spiritually serious or elite, like nuns or monks. I also think sometimes we get confused when we read the New Testament because Jesus in particular has some harsh words to say to religious leaders about the Sabbath in particular, and that might cause in us the desire to distance ourselves to not fall into that category today. Maybe some of us even were just raised in super legalistic churches where spiritual practices maybe weren't handled properly, and so we go, yeah, but I don't want to do that today. And I would say for those latter two, misuse should not lead to no use. It should just lead to our understanding for right use. And it's going to be difficult to, in just one discussion this morning, recover what I think has been lost for us as the church. But I hope at the very least it sparks a curiosity for those who've maybe missed out, maybe adds a perspective to those who are already practicing this. But overall, I hope that it affirms to us as the church that this is an essential pathway that the Lord wants to use in our formation into his image. And personally, as I shared a little bit earlier, I'm on this journey too, not as an expert here to convince you this morning of this, but as a fellow traveler saying, I want to invite you in to come see what we might be missing out when we don't put this into practice. So much of what I'll be sharing is sort of just the beginning of my own personal discovery of the sweetness of Sabbath. And the material is kind of drawn from a host of many voices, so really what follows I don't take much credit for. So where are we going this morning? A quick overview, if you're following along in your notes. We're going to take 3 stops in our discussion of Sabbath this morning. And first is we're going to just discuss why we need Sabbath. We're also going to discuss what is the Sabbath and hopefully build a bit of a definition around it so that it can begin to be something that we learn how to put into practice. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Hebrews 4, the scripture that sort of began this journey for us. Before we get into all of it, though, let's spend a moment together praying. Father, we thank you for this morning. God, we thank you for your goodness. God, we thank you for your promises. And Jesus, we bring ourselves under your authority. We bring ourselves under your promises. We bring ourselves under your way, Jesus. We ask that you would use this morning to have your way in us. And we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So our first stop that we're going to talk about is, why do we need Sabbath? Why do we have a need for Sabbath? How many of you have heard or maybe said something along the lines as this? When asked, how are you doing? The response is good, busy. You might have even said it this morning during the greeting time. I know I catch myself saying that all the time. Yeah, I'm good, but busy. It's a common thing because we are busy people. And especially when it comes to a summer in Montana, I don't know if you feel this, but these months are short and sweet. And boy, do we know how to pack it in summers. Do you feel that? It's like, okay, we get 2 months, go. And then we hunker down. We're busy people. And often because we're busy, we struggle having a healthy relationship with rest. Either we don't rest until it's like critical and we're like at a crisis stage and we have to rest. We don't rest long enough. We don't rest well enough. And I myself have struggled in my relationship with rest as well. In fact, a couple years ago when I began in my role here, just a few years in, I can remember a season of life where I in particular was just really frustrated with the fact that I had to sleep. It sounds silly, but I was literally mad that there's this thing called sleep that I had to do because it felt like the demands of the day, there just wasn't enough time. And here was this 8 hours that sat in my daily rhythm that could be useful, but I was just totally and utterly useless. I just slept. I did nothing. It's like, if I could just get a few of those hours, I could start to get a few more things done. And so I remember being frustrated at the fact that I had to sleep. Anyone been there before? Just me? Okay. Well, the Western world's formation of us has taught us to live beyond our limits, has pushed us to live beyond our limits. A few weeks ago, Donnie talked about the fact that we have limits and that God calls us to live within those limits in a way that honors how he has made us. And yet we live in a time in history when the demands for our attention, resources, contributions seem to be endlessly pushing us to live beyond those limits. And I want us to continue to think about this for a bit through this question that I would like us to just reflect on as we spend this time talking about our need. And I want to ask, what is your typical response to fighting burnout? See, busyness leads to burnout, but what is your typical response when it comes to fighting against getting to that place where you're feeling burnt out? Spend a few moments thinking about that. What is my typical response when it comes to fighting burnout? And I want us to think how the patterns of our lives reveal what we resort to when we come close to getting burnt out on maybe people, or work, or religion, school, politics. What is your typical response? And when you think about that question, I want you to think about it in terms of, what do I resort to apart from God? We've got the good and the bad, but I want us to focus specifically on what are our tendencies that we resort to apart from God when life starts to get demanding and I start to feel my tank getting empty. Do you withdraw? Do you shut down? Do you begin to sort of overmanage things to play them in your favor? You just try to hang on for dear life? Maybe you grow bitter. What's your typical response to fighting burnout? As I thought about this for myself, I could probably say, yeah, I could probably do all of those things. But my go-to is that I become a manager. And so I measure my little tank, and I go, this is what I have to give. And so I'm going to manage things in my favor so that I know I'm giving this amount, and it's not going to take me to E. Sort of like when your gas tank is low and you're like, okay, I can make it to the grocery store and back, but I can't go any further. I do that in my life with my schedule, with people, and I get calculated on how I portion my time and my energy and my love, and I'll just tell you I get a whole lot less generous with myself. Busyness leads to our burnout. And busyness does not discriminate age, does not discriminate life stage, it doesn't discriminate race. There's an endless demand, as I said earlier, for our attention, energy, finances, compassion, and it's more than we have to give on our own. And as I was preparing for this morning, the following quote was sort of like a flashlight into my soul. I don't know if you've ever had that experience before, where something just shines a light in there, and it showed sort of a less than desirable reality of how I've been doing recently in my coping with busyness in this season. Writer and teacher Parker Palmer, in his book, Let Your Life Speak, says, "Burnout is a state of emptiness, to be sure, but it does not result from giving all that I have. It merely reveals the nothingness from which I was trying to give in the first place." Ooh, that hit hard. Okay. We talked about our response to busyness. God has a response to busyness as well, and he wants us to employ it to fight against busyness and protect us from burnout and bitterness, and I bet you can guess what it is. The Sabbath, what we're talking about this morning. And it does so much of life that God's designed for us so that we can have a day to detach from the demands of the world, so that we can receive the refreshment and enjoyment that comes with living life with God. And the outcome is I receive greater union with God, so that I can face the demands on earth with greater resiliency. It's a day to interrupt the pattern of thinking or living that might be contributing to unhealth in my soul. It's a day that I can bring my impatient and work-addicted self back to resting in the Father, so that my weary soul can be filled up again. Our souls have cracks in them. We need God to fill us, not just once, but over and over again. Pastor A.J. Swoboda comments from his book, Subversive Sabbath, saying that the Sabbath has largely been forgotten by the church, which has uncritically mimicked the rhythms of the industrial and success-obsessed West. The result? Our road-weary, exhausted churches have largely failed to integrate Sabbath into their lives as vital elements of Christian discipleship. It's not as though we don't love God. We love God deeply. We don't know how to sit with God anymore. And we've become perhaps the most emotionally exhausted, psychologically overworked, and spiritually malnourished people in history. So my question to you this morning is, do you feel weary in any part of your life? Is there any part of you that feels just emotionally exhausted? Maybe you feel spiritually malnourished, or just worn out with what seems like there's no end in sight. See, I think we're at a moment in church history where we need to seriously and thoroughly consider, how did we get here? And where are we going if nothing changes? Other Christian thinkers have noticed this pattern and have commented in on it as well, saying, Dallas Willard offers that hurry is the great enemy of the spiritual life in our day. And N.T. Wright encourages us, saying that it's only when we slow down our lives that we can catch up with God. So the Sabbath is an active practice to fight hurry, to slow down our lives, to catch up with God. And I don't think I need to spend a ton more time here convincing us that we need those things more in our lives today. So I want to take some time next to talk specifically about what is the Sabbath, building a definition around it to help us put it into practice or continue to practice it. And so this definition, by the way, is not an all-inclusive definition. We're really only covering a fraction. And I would just encourage you, if this is something that you're doing or want to do more of, that you would just keep going and keep studying and learning. There's lots of great resources out there that help us build definition. But we're going to build our definition sort of in two ways this morning. And the first is we're going to talk about what is the Sabbath not. And the second way we're going to talk about it is what is the Sabbath. So if you're following along in your notes, you'll see some blanks here. But what is the Sabbath not? Let's begin there first. The Sabbath is not just a day off. Taking a day off is just part of it, but when that's all we're doing when we Sabbath, we're kind of missing the heart of the time altogether. It's a day fueled by rest and worship. So the Sabbath isn't just a day off. It's also not a set of rules. It's made up of a collection of best practices, but many of us, I think, sometimes fear becoming too religious, right? Unless we end up sort of avoiding the discipline of spiritual practices because we don't want to be too religious. But the Sabbath doesn't come with a list of rules. It's just rather a way for us to live. And I would say, especially when you practice and discuss Sabbath within your faith community, you realize how much variance to the Sabbath there is and can be, and that's a good thing. So it's not just a day off, it's not a set of rules, and also it's not a reward for hard work. Sometimes we might only Sabbath if we feel like we've worked hard enough or earned it. And if anything, the Sabbath is a reminder that the work is always going to be there, and it's always going to remain incomplete to some measure. So quick poll in here. Who are the people who have said something along the lines of, when I finish everything, then I'll rest? Anyone been in that group before? Yeah, me too. So the Sabbath, for those of us who identify with that statement, is going to be a weekly challenge to help us stay on guard against believing that we are only as good as what we produce. And I would say, additionally, it's also going to help us shape us to enjoy the limits of our humanity rather than to grasp at trying to be God in our lives. So it's not a day off, it's not a set of rules, it's not reward for hard work, and lastly, it's not a religious hobby that we do as believers. I think there's a danger that we can know enough to be dangerous. And what do I mean by that? I think we can acknowledge the truth in the good of the Sabbath and say, yeah, that rest and rhythm is good, and occasionally embrace it and talk about it with others and maybe even advocate for it, but only ever becoming a mere acquaintance rather than a devoted and connected friend. And just a confession, in my journey with Sabbath, I'm at this crossroads right now, and I want to get beyond, make sure I get beyond the acquaintance with. Sabbath is an invitation not just for temporary change in our lives, but it's a deep transformative work that's to be done in us, so that it's not just something that we do, but it's a way that we reshape how we think and see and live in the world today. So that's what the Sabbath is not, but let's talk about what the Sabbath is. And in order to do that, I want us to just quickly review some Jewish history. So we know that the Egyptians enslaved Israel for 400 years. That's a really long time. And Israel was driven by sort of this tyranny of a work culture where their identity became, what can I produce? For 400 years, can you imagine the generational patterns of thinking and living that came from being slaves for that long? And we know from the book of Exodus that God delivered them and sent them into the wilderness as a gracious act. He delivered them from the tyranny of the Egyptians, and he sent them into this place. And I believe he sent them into this wilderness place so that two things could happen. The first, so that they could have some space to unlearn that identity that maybe got ingrained in them. You're only as good as what you do. And two, so they could have a little space to relearn who they are in God. And isn't that true for us today too, that we often need some space to unlearn some things that we've maybe thought or been taught so that we can relearn who we are? And it's in the wilderness that God gave them the 10 Commandments. Not for salvation, not to like, hey, you got to make it up to me, but as a way to say, this is what the life of a redeemed people looks like. This is how they live. And the Sabbath is in those commandments. Interestingly, too, the Exodus narrative of the Sabbath is that God wants his people to remember. And you can see that in Exodus 28. It says, remember the Sabbath. But if you flip forward to the book of Deuteronomy and look at chapter 5, verse 12, the Deuteronomy narrative of the Sabbath is so you observe the Sabbath. So God's calling his people to remember the Sabbath, and then later he's saying observe. A few observations about that. The wilderness was the space that God used to help Israel sort of unlearn so that they could remember and relearn who they were in him. And then after that, it became important for them to not just remember, but for them to observe this so that they could preserve their identity in God. Rich Velotis, he's a pastor in Queens, and he was actually one of the main stage speakers at Life Conference, which is the conference we went to this summer with high schoolers. He wrote a book called The Deeply Formed Life, and he talks about the Sabbath, and he says this: the brilliance of Sabbath keeping is not so much about our keeping of the Sabbath as it is the Sabbath is keeping us. So I think Jewish history has become a part of our story today. And in order to honor God with our lives and identify with him, we too need to unlearn and remember to be able to return to him in this way so that we can observe and live in a way that has God central to our daily life and week. So what is the Sabbath? Well, we're starting to build our definition of what it is, and you're seeing some themes. It's remembrance and it's observance, but how do we actually do that? If you're new to the practice, okay, how do I actually do this? Let's talk about that for a little bit. The Sabbath is just 24 hours to stop. So that word Sabbath actually means to stop. But to stop what? What am I supposed to stop? John Mark Comer, he's a pastor in Portland, Oregon. He puts it helpfully this way: to stop want, to stop worry, and to stop work. I like that. It's memorable. To stop want, worry, and work. What do we mean by want? I'm probably on the Sabbath not going to go shopping because I'm going to probably want something at the store, an outfit, something to put in my home. So we're going to maybe avoid that. Probably not going to scroll my social media feed because I'm going to see someone doing something really awesome that I'm going to probably want to do. Or flipping through a magazine. I'm probably not going to tune in on HGTV. I don't know if you've experienced this before, but anytime you watch HGTV, you just hate your home. It's like my home is just not that good anymore. It was good, but it could be so much better. I just don't have any thankfulness for my home after that show. So I'm probably not going to turn that on. And when we stop want, we actually allow ourselves the space to practicing gratitude. We have to stop something. We have to stop putting ourselves in spaces where we want. We also have to stop worry. And I would say a really easy way to do that is just to click out of whatever sources you grab your news from. So electronically, fold up the paper, whatever it is. Stop reading the news just for a day, just for 24 hours, because when we stop worrying about what's going on in the world, we're saying, God, we believe you are in control of the world. And it's a time for us to stop work as well. This is 24 hours of no have-tos or ought-tos. And Eugene Peterson talks about the Sabbath in his book, Working the Angles, and he says that Sabbath keeping often feels like an interruption and an interference with our routines. I feel that. It challenges assumptions we gradually build up in our daily work that it's indispensable in making the world go. Stopping work allows us to stop pretending that we are God. So these are some of the things that sort of clutter our minds and clutter our hearts from remembering and observing who we are in God. And a great prayer to begin your Sabbath with is what's called benevolent detachment. And it sounds like this: Jesus, I give everyone and everything to you. I give everyone and everything to you. That's a big prayer. It might involve you having to repeat it a few times before you can mean it. I know I use this prayer often. I give everyone and everything to you. But the Sabbath is more than just what we don't do. That's just part one. So let's go on in our definition. What else does the Sabbath do? What else is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is a place that reveals. So it's a place where I stop, and when I stop, there's something that happens. There's a revelation that comes when I stop some of these activities that I'm normally doing throughout the week. I'm learning more about myself, and I'm learning more about God. And we might be tempted to think this thing: when we get to the Sabbath, all of a sudden we're going to transcend into this peaceful state and remain that way for 24 hours, and it's going to be great. But it is amazing how quickly our flesh wants to rear its ugly head. And I know this from personal experience. I can have had an amazing time in my prayer closet and come out and be short with my wife. And I usually realize it when she asks very kindly, "How was your quiet time?" Okay, I get it. So we're not going to transcend into this perfect, peaceful state when we say, we're going to do it. But I think it's key for us to realize that things are going to come up out of us when we stop, and we need to pay attention to those things. And I would encourage you with this, that maybe it could be discouraging, like when you realize the contents of your soul coming up and being less than desirable parts of you, coming out. But these are all opportunities to return to God. If your mind or your heart drifts from God's, these are just opportunities to return to Him. Counselor and teacher Ed Welch says that the maturity of the believer is marked by how quickly we return to the Lord. It's not if we leave Him, when we do. And as we grow in our maturity, we learn that returning is just part of our Christian walk. It's a way for us to bring all of who we really are to all of who God really is. And so when the messy parts of us come up on Sabbath, we pay attention to those things and we go, God, I was a little impatient, but I'm going to bring my impatience to the fact that you are patient. I'm going to bring my whatever to the fact that you are loving and forgiving. I'm bringing who I am to who God really is. So it's a place for us to stop. It's a place that reveals, and as mentioned earlier, it's a day for rest and worship. I think Sabbath is a way we really can kind of turn up the volume of our worship of God as we enjoy the good things that he has made us to enjoy. We use the day to fill the day with activities that fill our soul and cause us to deeply enjoy the giver of all good gifts like food and naps and nature and family and friends and creating and recreating. It's a day for us to get so caught up in delight that we become self-forgetful. Have you ever seen like when a kid gets really into something that they're just really loving and they kind of lose track of the world around them? That's kind of what the Sabbath is, and God delights to see us enjoy the good things that he has created us to enjoy. Lastly, the Sabbath is our weapon for resiliency in the world. Dallas Willard says that we must arrange our lives in a way so that sin no longer looks good to us. Sabbath is our weekly training that helps us to learn not to be impressed with what the world offers apart from God. Like, how easy is it to tempt a tired person? How easy is it to tempt an unsatisfied person? In the Sabbath, we find our rest and our satisfaction. It gives us resiliency in the world. I heard a pastor share a story about a Nazi journal from a soldier that was found, and he, in it, talks a little bit about Jews practicing the Sabbath in a concentration camp. And there was a particular page where in his journal, he was writing to his commander. And he was saying what he observed in his time with the Jews. And he said to his commander, it's going to be in our best interest to do whatever it takes for us to disrupt their practice of Sabbath. Because he said when they were able to keep the Sabbath, he observed it was like they got their spirits back. Can you picture that level of resiliency? Being a Jew in a concentration camp with a renewed spirit after Sabbath? We have access to that kind of resiliency when we practice it today. And personally, I want that, and I know I need that. But what if this is something new to you, and you're like, okay, great, I'm sort of grasping at it, but like, how do I put it into practice? If you're new and want to put this into practice, I would just say several things as an encouragement to you. And the first is when you try something new, there's this chart called the J curve that shows you're actually going to get worse before you get better. And like that's both good news and bad news, right? Because we all want to be good at something right away. But when we put something into practice for the first time, we often get worse before we get better. So I would just say give it some time. I know I get caught up in this and I'm like measuring things from week to week. I'm like, man, this week wasn't that good. And so maybe I should just give up. But like think about it more than just in the week to week. Think about it in terms of like 3 to 5 years. It's like a much bigger time scale. And it's in the name. It is a practice. It takes practice. And I would say because of that, it's nourished when we do it within a community, like most spiritual practices. And I want to just quickly, before we move to our last point, I want to address parents in the room. If you are a parent of a young kid or youth, I just want to say I have made the observation that over the years have caused some concern. And it's that we're letting the lives of our kids and our youth get really busy. They are your primary spiritual community. When you put Sabbath into practice, it's nourishing your spiritual community. They need you to lead the way if you aren't already doing this in your family. They need you. So why do we need the Sabbath? What is it not? What is it? Well, now let's talk briefly about Hebrews 4, which is where really this kind of kicked off our interest in Sabbath. And you could begin to turn to Hebrews 4 right now if you would like to use the Worship Center Bible. We're going to be on pages 1002, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 5. And as you turn there, I just want to give you a quick overview of kind of what we're going to be looking at this morning. The author of Hebrews is actually using a portion of this letter to kind of expand on Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11. And the author is finding significance in this word, rest. And before we get into our passage in chapter 4, I want to briefly just go over what he talks about and concludes in chapter 3. Author of Hebrews is highlighting in chapter 3 that the main point of Psalm 95 is that God's people, Israel, who lived in the wilderness generation, refused to trust God to bring them into the promised land. And therefore, they forfeited God's rest that he offered to them. And the nature of their rebellion had to do with unbelief. And even though we could point to many times that they rebelled, this was the specific instance that determined that the wilderness generation would die in the wilderness, except Caleb and Joshua. Okay, that's the history, the backdrop against what our author is speaking to his audience in this chapter. So let's tune in to Hebrews 4, 1 through 5, and read together. It says, "Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said, 'As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest,' although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again, this passage, he said, 'They shall not enter my rest.'" Well, I want us to just look briefly at a few of these verses in this passage. And the first one is in verse 1. And I want us to note that the author is not talking about the literal possession of a territory necessarily, but of a different kind of rest. That God's promise in the wilderness was both for then, but it was also a foreshadow of something that was to come. And our author is essentially kind of making the argument that the Christian faith is built on us taking God at his promises. He goes on to, in verse 2, to sort of link the historical account of Israel with the audience that he's writing today, linking them together, saying that they both received good news. Now, some forfeited that good news, but that good news remains accessible for us today. But what was the good news that he was talking about? Looking at verses 3 through 5, there's this phrase, "my rest," that comes from Psalm 95:11, and it comes up twice in this little passage. This is not just rest God gives, but when he says "my rest," he's talking about the rest that God experiences and enjoys himself. Genesis 2 reminds us that after the work of creation was complete, God rested. And just a little aside, I think it's really interesting that Adam and Eve's first day on earth after being created was God's Sabbath. God's rest is an already reality, not just a future hope, and it's this rest that he's inviting his people to share in. So you might be asking, okay, but what does this have to do with our conversation with Sabbath this morning? The last thing that I believe Sabbath is for us is a taste of heaven. Sabbath is a taste of heaven. When we take a day to stop work and worry and want, we open ourselves up to enjoying God. We're inviting heaven to come to earth. Revelation 14:13 says, "And I heard a voice from heaven saying, 'Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them.'" When we Sabbath, we are embracing the present reality of God's rest and future hope that we enter it fully and forever. There is going to be a time when earth is restored to its former glory, and Jesus is going to come back to get all of the hell out of it. And he will come back to establish it as it once was in the garden before sin. And if the Christian faith is about taking God up on his promises, then when we choose to Sabbath, we must realize that this is a practice that's pointing us to the pinnacle of all of God's promises. That there's going to be ultimate, eternal rest for those who trust in God with their whole lives. There is ultimate, eternal rest for those who put their trust in God with their whole lives. Sabbath is our reminder of what's coming. And yet, for others, it's also something that can be forfeited. We can forfeit this good news. So we've talked about our need for Sabbath, we've talked about what it's not, and we've talked about what it is. And in closing, I would invite the worship team to come up. God's rest is what we were created for, but I realize there might be two different groups, either in this room or tuning in online, that I would like to spend the remainder of our time addressing. And the first group of you might be saying something along the lines of, okay, great, Sabbath sounds great in theory, but it's a practice that maybe just doesn't seem realistic for me today. I just want to remind you that the literal fabric of our universe has the rhythm of rest woven into it. And a smart person once said that when you go against the grain of the universe, you get splinters. God has made it uncomfortable for us to go against his design. We will be more comfortable and more ourselves when we try to put this into practice in our lives. So my encouragement to you is just try. If it's not something that you're practicing, just try. Do it in a faith community where you can talk about it and struggle and work it out together. And we have a resource for you that you can take home if that's something you're interested in doing this week. It's going to be on the table out by these front doors, and you can just grab one of those as you go. And I hope that it helps give you a framework for beginning this practice if you are new to it. But I realize there's a second audience that might be present here in this room or tuning in online, and it's those who have yet to fully trust God and his ultimate promise that he's the only way to eternal life and rest. And to that audience, I just want to read a few more verses from chapter 4, picking up in verses 6 through 7, which say, "It still remains that some will enter the rest. And those who formerly had the gospel preached to them did not go in because of their disobedience. Therefore, God again set a certain day, calling it today. When a long time later he spoke through David, as was said before, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." We know we only have today. So I beg you, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. We have a team of people who would love to come and pray with you this morning, and so we want to give you some space to say, today, I want to declare that God is who he says he is, that he will keep his promises, and I don't want to miss out on what he is offering, both rest now and eternally. And so if that's you, we're going to take some time to sing this last song together. I want to just encourage you, use this time together to talk with God about that. And I'll come back up here and close us out and invite our team to come up so that you can have space also to share with someone about that and maybe even pray with someone about that. But for all of us, let's just enter our time of worship together wherever we are at.